To understand what was erased, we have to start with the first entry in the file, not the court cases and raids, not the propaganda posters, but the plant itself, standing alone on a cold slope in Central Asia long before there were nations to outlaw it. Picture yourself in the Altai Mountains, in the deep interior of the continent. The air is thin and clear. The wind scrapes over rock and coarse grass, carrying the dry scent of soil that has known very little softness. Somewhere on this ridge, in this harsh belt between forest and steppe, a wild stand of plants shivers in the wind, narrow leaves, rough stems, resin catching the last light. Cannabis Sativa, the record tells us, originated here around 12,000 years ago. That date is our first exhibit. 12,000 years is not a casual number. It reaches back into a world almost unrecognizable to us, the time when most of what we now call history had not yet begun to write itself. And yet here in this high, hard country, one species of plant emerged whose future would be entangled with almost every human culture that followed. Run your fingers in your mind along that stem. Feel the fibrous strength in the stalk, the oily weight in the seeds, the sticky film on the flowers. 3 different textures, 3 different textures, 3 different chemistries, all in one organism: food, fiber, resin. It is as if this plant arrived preloaded with multiple gifts, waiting for someone to notice. The official story treats cannabis as a recent intruder in the human record, an upstart drug that wandered into our lives only a few generations ago. But the origin point in the Altai, 12 millennia back, tells us something very different. It suggests that from almost the beginning of our settled story, this plant was there, growing in the margins, observing us as we learned to shape stone and soil. The next entry in the case file does not appear in the mountains. It appears on a fragment of pottery, on an island edge touching warm sea. Now stand with me on a small rise in what is now called Taiwan, but pass your mind back to around 8000 BCE. The sun is lower, the shoreline different, the forest thicker. In a pit dwelling, someone shapes wet clay with their hands, pressing cords into the surface to decorate or to roughen it for grip. The shard survives, the hands do not. Under a museum light now, this pottery is just a muted fragment, its surface a faint pattern of parallel lines, but under a microscope another story appears. Those lines are not random. They are the impressions of a specific cord, twisted from a specific plant. The record identifies it: hemp, cannabis. Earliest evidence 8000 BCE pottery with hemp cord impressions in Taiwan. Let that sink in. Our second exhibit is not a seed, not a charred stalk tossed aside as fuel. It is a finished cord, already processed, already twisted, already used as a tool to leave a deliberate pattern in clay. This is not a plant that humans have just discovered. This is a plant that is already being worked. Feel for a moment the texture of that cord against your thumb and forefinger, the slight roughness that resists your pull. This is not a fragile grass. This is not a fragile grass. This is structural material, rope netting bindings, the kind of thing that lets you drag, tie, lift, and endure. What should trouble us is the gap between Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2. We have the origin of Cannabis Sativa in the Altai around 12,000 years ago. We have hemp cord pressed into pottery in Taiwan around 8000 BC. Between them lies a broad silence. No written testimony, no clear record of which hands carried seeds from a cold interior mountain range to a distant island shore. And yet, by 8000 BCE, those hands are not merely gathering the plant. They are mastering it. They know how to strip fiber from stalk, how to twist it to avoid breakage, how to use it in the most permanent technology they possess at that moment: fired clay, meant to last. The pattern begins to emerge more clearly when we move forward another 3000 years and inland again. Imagine the yellow light of late afternoon on the plains of what will one day be called northern China. The soil is a fine, patient silt. In a shallow pit in the earth, a settlement takes shape: circular houses, storage pits, the geometry of early planning. This is the world of the Neolithic Yangshao culture. around 5000 BC. In the soil of these sites, in the imprint of weaving on fragments, we find our third entry. The Yangshao wove hemp into textiles. Visualize a length of that cloth stretched between two hands. Not as smooth as latest silks, not as smooth as latest silks, not as soft as modern cotton, but strong, breathable, able to withstand wear. Under low lamplight, the weave is visible warp and weft, fibers crossing in a rhythm, each thread once a living stem of Cannabis Sativa. This is our third exhibit. The plant is now clothing bodies. Again, the leap is larger than it first appears. Move from wild stands on a mountain slope to cord impressed in clay to organized textile production, and the implications deepen. Hemp is no longer a material of chance. To weave on any consistent scale, you need predictable fiber. To have predictable fiber, you need to tend the plants, to harvest them at the right time, to process them in systematic ways. Nothing here proves extensive fields or complex agriculture, but the textiles are testimony that hemp is now embedded in daily life, wrapped around skin, insulating against cold, forming the flexible shell of early communities. Listen for a moment to the sound in that settlement. The soft clack of loom weights, fibers sliding against each other as they are drawn out, children's voices somewhere beyond, the low murmuring of adults planning, remembering, working, in the background of that soundscape. Cannabis is there not as a whisper of intoxication, but as a constant, quiet infrastructure. By 4000 BCE, the record gives us a fourth and very different kind of entry. In the lists and categorizations of early Chinese culture, hemp appears not merely as full plant, not just another fiber source, but as something with a status that crosses into the sacred. By around 4000 BCE in China, hemp is recorded as a sacred grain, named alongside millet, rice, wheat, and soybeans. Pulls on that phrase sacred grain. Grain is more than food. In early agrarian societies, grain is calendar, ceremony, survival. To be counted among the core grains is to occupy a central place in ritual and memory. When a plant steps into that circle, it is no longer just raw material. It becomes a partner in the covenant between humans and the land. Picture a granary, cool and dim, its floor swept smooth. Clay vessels stand against the wall. In one millet, in another, rice, in another, wheat or its early relatives, and in another, hemp seeds, small, dense, oil minus rich, pouring through fingers with a subtle, almost metallic wrestle. The record does not give us the taste on the tongue, but we can infer the rules. Pressed for oil, ground, eaten whole. Hemp is entering the human body, not as an illicit substance, but as nourishment, as offering. What should jar us here is the dissonance with our inherited story. Today, in many legal codes, cannabis is defined and classified as a dangerous drug with no accepted use, locked into the tightest restrictions. Described as having high potential for abuse and no accepted medical role, yet in this early Chinese schema, the same plant is named among the very pillars of sustenance. This does not prove that ancient people were correct and modern law is wrong, but it forces us to entertain a possibility that the way we have classified this plant in the last century is the anomaly, and that the deeper, older record shows a much wider range of relationships. Run your hand again, in imagination, across the timeline we have laid out. Altai Mountains, about 12,000 years ago origin. A wild plant, loaded with multiple potential uses, standing in hard light on cold slopes. Taiwan around 8000 BCE, hemp cord impressed into pottery. A deliberate choice of material used in a deliberate act of making, evidence that the plant's fibers are already valued and processed. Yangshao culture around 5000 BC, hemp woven into textiles, the plant now integrated into clothing, into daily protection, requiring more structured cultivation and knowledge. China around 4000 BC, hemp named as a sacred grain alongside millet, rice, wheat and soybeans, the plant crossing the threshold from useful to revered, feeding bodies and ritual. For points, for entries, they stretch across thousands of years and a wide geography, but they share a quiet, insistent theme wherever we see early complexity pottery, weaving, sacred lists this plant is present. Now notice what is missing from these early records. There is no moral panic, no special criminal category, no isolated mention of madness or crime. The plant appears in the file as fiber, as textile, as grain, as sacred. The aspects we have chosen to magnify in recent history, smoke, intoxication, prohibition, are absent from these first four exhibits. Feel the weight of that absence, like a missing volume in a shelf of bound records. The silence itself is a clue. It suggests that our modern obsession with one narrow facet of cannabis may be a late distortion, a zooming in on a single property, while the broader context is quietly pushed out of frame. And yet, even within this limited ancient dossier, a question begins to press in. How does a plant become sacred grain? Useful plants are everywhere. Weeds that can be twisted into rough rope, seeds that can be eaten in a pinch. Almost every landscape has them. But to rise from useful to central, from occasional to revered, something more is required: reliability, versatility, a sense perhaps that the plant is giving more than it takes. The Altai origin, the Taiwan cord, the Yang Shout textiles, the sacred grain status. Taken together, they sketch a pattern. Cannabis is not hovering at the edges of early human life. It is threaded through the core technologies and the core foods. The unsettling possibility is this: by the time written myths and official histories begin, a long relationship with this plant is already in place, so familiar that it hardly needs to be explained. What we are seeing in these early exhibits are just the tips of a much older, largely unrecorded cycle of trial, error, and innate knowledge. If that is true, then our modern narratives where cannabis suddenly erupts into view as a problem to be solved are not the whole story. They are a late chapter in a much longer book. As you listen in the dark, imagine the feel of hemp cloth on your skin, the weight of a hemp rope in your hand, the quiet sound of seeds pouring into a ceramic jar. For thousands of years, those were the dominant sounds and textures in this plant's testimony. Only much later does the tone of the record change, and that raises the question that will follow us through the rest of this investigation: when and why did a sacred grain become a forbidden substance? To answer that, we have to listen more closely to the places where the record grows specific, where the plant is not just a background texture, but named, tested, classified. Imagine a low-lit room, oil lamp flickering against packed earth walls, a scroll unrolled on a wooden table. You can almost hear the soft rasp of a brush and fiber, the faint smell of ink and dried herbs. On that imagined table lies one of our key exhibits, the tradition attached to the legendary Emperor Shen Nong, dated by later writers to around 2700 BC. In the stories, he is the divine farmer, the figure who walks the hills tasting plants, testing poisons and medicines on his own body, separating what heals from what harms. We cannot treat those tales as literal biography, but we can treat what comes later as a record of what his name came to represent: systematic experimentation with plants. Around 50 CA, long after Shen Nong himself had passed into legend, a text appears that bears his name, the Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing. Think of it as an early case file of pharmacology. In its entries, cannabis is not a vague, full correct presence. It is listed directly as a substance to be used against malaria, against rheumatism, against pain. The record is clear: someone, over some span of generations, had watched this plant change the course of fevers, ease stiff joints, soften suffering. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel a pulse under your fingers, the wrist of a patient, the cool touch of a healer's hand, the quiet of a room where someone is waiting to see if the pain will ebb. That text does not stand alone. It fits into a broader pattern in Chinese records, a careful dissection of the plant itself. Not just cannabis, but parts, functions, roles. The seeds, known as maren, appear as food and as medicine. The fibers become the basis of textiles and rope, the tensile infrastructure of daily life. And separate from both of these, the flowers, the resin bearing tops of the plant, are recognized for their psychopative effects. This is not the language of superstition. This is classification. In a modern case file, you would see headings and subheaders, different pages for different contexts. Here, the categories are embedded in names and uses, but the effect is the same. One plant, 3 distinct domains: nourishment and digestion, material strength and fabric, altered states of consciousness. Run your fingertips in your mind along a length of hemp rope, the roughness, the strength of faint plant smell. Then imagine the small, smooth seeds spilling into a palm, and a separate bundle of dried flowers, sticky, aromatic, set apart. The separation is not accidental. It is operational. A pattern begins to emerge. For the seeds to be recorded as food and medicine, their relative safety must have been known. For the fibers to become central to rope and cloth, their durability and processing must have been understood. For the flowers to be singled out for their psychopative properties, at least some people must have been deliberately seeking and managing those effects. None of this reads like a culture stumbling blindly into intoxication. It reads like a long, accumulated familiarity divided into precise roles. When the Shen Ongben Kaojing list cannabis for malaria, rheumatism, pain, it is tracing that familiarity into the body. It is transforming lived experience. Someone's fever breaking after a preparation, someone's swollen joints loosening into text. That is the moment when memory hardens into record. And then, centuries later, the plant migrates into an even more literal medium of memory. In 105 CE, a figure named Kai Lund is recorded as having paper-making using hemp fibers. That date is not mythology, it is an entry point in the bureaucratic chronicle. Take a breath and imagine the sound of a pulp being beaten, water sloshing in vats, sheets being lifted and laid to dry, a new surface being born out of shredded plant. Here, cannabis steps over a threshold. It is no longer just the subject of a medical entry, it becomes the very fabric upon which entries are written. Hemp fibers reconfigured as paper turn the plant into a medium for storing language, law, poetry, accounts. It becomes quite literally one of the substances in which civilization remembers itself. Picture, for a moment, a stack of early hemp paper drying in a shaded courtyard, edges curling slightly in the warm air, the fibers faintly visible when you hold a sheet up to the light. On that quiet, fragile surface, someone will later write prescriptions, official decrees, histories that mention cannabis and 1,000 other things. The plant is both within the record and beneath it, so by the time statecraft and scholarship are in full motion, cannabis is everywhere in the Chinese archive, whether named or hidden in the ropes that hold loads, in the cloth that clothes bodies, in the paper that holds ink, and in the pharmacopoeia that lists cures. The official story in these texts is not of a dangerous, destabilizing substance. It is of a versatile ally, but written records tend to be conservative. They emphasize what is safe, repeatable, sanctioned. If we want to understand the full range of the plant's roles, we have to turn to a different kind of file, the grave. Now imagine a cold, high wind sweeping across a cemetery in western China, the sky wide, the soil pale and dry. Beneath your feet, there are sealed chambers that have not seen light into under 500 years. In one of those places, the Jers-en-Kol cemetery, dated to around 500 BCE, archaeologists opened tombs and found something unexpected in the burnt residues: cannabis, not just present, but with high levels of THC, the primary psychoactive component of the plant, not a scrap of old rope, not the inert seeds left over from food, but the potent parts, burned in context with the dead. From a strictly utilitarian point of view, that is a problem. If cannabis is only a source of fiber and grain, there is no reason for the most active, intoxicating material to be concentrated and burned at a burial site. The presence of high-THC cannabis in a funerary context functions as a piece of contrary evidence. It suggests, at the very least, that someone wanted the psychoactive effects, whether for the mourners, for the shaman, or symbolically for the departed. It suggests selection, intention, perhaps even specialization. plants grown or chosen because their flowers had stronger effects, then harvested and used in ritual. Picture the scene in your mind: a night burial, air-thinned cold, a small fire burning in a sheltered space near the grave. The scent of the smoke would be sharp, resinous. Unlike simple wood, around it, figures moving slowly, half in shadow, voices low, tinting. The altered state is not recreational here, it is part of a rite. A second burial record deepens this implication. In a Sabexai tomb dated to around 750 BC, a different team of excavators uncovered the body of what appears to have been a shaman. Beside this figure lay a substantial quantity of cannabis, around 800 grams, carefully processed, and again, high in THC, 800 grams, almost a kilogram, not a stray handful, not an incidental inclusion. In a modern evidence locker that would be logged, weighed, photographed, cross-minus referenced. Here, in the quiet of a burial chamber, it tells its own story. Imagine standing at the edge of that open tomb, cool air spilling out, carrying the faint, stale trace of dried plant. Your flashlight catches a compact mass of leaves and flowers, long since desiccated, but still recognizably separated, prepared. This is not debris. It is a cache. The association matters. The plant lies not with an anonymous laborer, but with a ritual specialist, someone buried with the tools of their practice. The processing matters. This is cannabis that has been handled, sorted, readied. The chemistry matters to high-minus THC material, potent enough to ensure a strong psychoactive effect. If cannabis were merely a mundane crop, we would expect husks, traces, chance inclusions. Instead, we find a professionally curated, psychoactive store, interred as if it were as essential to the shaman's identity as any costume or instrument. The tomb functions as a sealed testimony. In this culture, at this time, cannabis is not peripheral, it is central to spiritual or ecstatic work. Set the Jerzen Call Cemetery in the Sabexai tomb side with the Shen-Long tradition and the later medical text. On one side, from entries describing cannabis as a treatment for malaria, rheumatism, pain, distinguishing seeds, fibers, flowers by function. On the other, physical residues of burnt and stored high-minus THC material clustered around death, healing, and ritual. Run the data together and a coherent picture begins to form. Cannabis, in this slice of the human story, is a threefold technology. The seeds nourish and soothe the body. The fibers bind and clothe and, eventually, hold writing. The flowers open doors inward, upward, or sideways, depending on your frame of reference. For shamans, mourners, and the sick, we are not looking at a world where people are ignorant of the difference between eating a bowl of seeds and inhaling smoke from burning flowers. The classification of plant parts in the written record and the concentration of psychoactive material in graves both insist on the same point: someone is paying close attention to what each part does. If you listen to the silence between these exhibits, you can almost hear a set of unwritten protocols: when to use the seeds, how to twist the fibers, who is allowed to handle the flowers, how much to burn, what songs to sing while the smoke rolls in the air. And yet, when you hold this ancient case file up against our own official narratives, there is a fracture. In the modern story, cannabis appears suddenly as a dangerous intoxicant, especially once smoked, something societies must learn to control or eradicate. But in these older records, the act of burning psychoactive cannabis in ritual, of burying a shaman with nearly a kilogram of prepared high-minus THC material, is not framed as deviant. It is woven into the accepted structure of life, death, and healing. This does not prove that every use was wise, or that there were no abuses as wise, no fears, no taboos. The record we have is selective, but it does for us to consider a different baseline, one in which the plant is assumed to be useful, powerful, and manageable, rather than inherently corrupting. If that is the deep pattern textual classification, medical integration, ritual centrality, then the later criminalization of the plant is not the beginning of control. It is a second-order event, a reclassification layered on top of a much older set of rules. And somewhere between the shaman's tomb and the modern courtroom, between hemp paper and prohibition law, something in the story shifts. The question that hangs over these graves and scrolls is simple, but heavy. At what point did the psychopative flower, once entrusted to healers and mourners and mythic emperors, cross a threshold and become, in the eyes of later powers, an unacceptable way of changing consciousness? We will have to follow the trail forward, across continents and centuries, to see how that turning was engineered, and who paid the price when the sacred ally was recast as contraband. For now, keep the image of that quiet tomb in your mind, the still body, the bundled cannabis, the weight of stone above. The plant lying there is part of a system that once made sense. The mystery is why that system was later declared intolerable. From that sealed tomb in the high desert, we step out into a larger field of evidence. The next entry in the record comes from the steppe and ocean of grass under a hard sky, between about 900 and 200 BC. Imagine the wind there at night, thin and cold, combing through the stalks like fingers. This is Scythian country. The official story remembers the Scythians as mounted warriors, raiders moving like weather. But one of our primary witnesses, the Greek historian Herodotus, leaves a more intimate testimony. He describes them using cannabis in purification rituals after funerals, not casually, as a deliberate rite to follow the dead. That is our claim. The evidence is twofold. First, a text Herodotus in the 5th century BC, writing down what he says he observed and heard. Second, archaeology. Scythian tombs have yielded gold vessels whose residues, when analyzed, reveal cannabis and opium together. Gold vessels, not crude cups or broken pothurst, but finely worked containers, buried with the elite, carrying the chemical fingerprints of plants that alter pain, mood, and perception. The combination is telling. We have a narrative purification after contact with death. We have physical residue, cannabis and opium in ritual minus grade containers. Together they form man exhibitor culture, using this plant not as a background intoxicant, but as a tool to move between states. To cleanse, to cross a threshold and return. If our species had stumbled on cannabis randomly, as a mere recreational curiosity, we would not expect it to appear here, in this specific context, funerary, liminal, paired with another deep minus-acting drug, housed in wort gold, anchored by a historian's report. What it implies is a pattern you've already started to see. The plant as an instrument for managing boundary conditions between life and death, between pain and ritual purity, between ordinary time and sacred time. Now follow the line of steppe migration south and east, into a different climate, a different language, but a strangely familiar pattern. The file marked India opens between about 2000 and 1000 BC, with the movement of Aryan minus speaking peoples into the subcontinent. Somewhere in that window, cannabis arrives with them. By the time we reach the Vedas texts compiled between roughly 1500 and 500 BCE, the plant is already present under another name. They call it fang. The record there does not treat fang as a novelty. It names it as a sacred plant. In a list of holy substances, it is not marginal, it is integrated. This is our second major claim. By the time the Indo-Aryan religious corpus crystallizes, cannabis has been folded into the architecture of the sacred. Overlay that with another strand of evidence, association with fever. This figure, ascetic and wild lord of destruction and transformation, becomes entangled with the plant. The bond is not anecdotal, it is structural. The god who dances at the end of cycles is linked with a plant that shifts consciousness, loosens the grip of ordinary fear, and makes pain more distant. If you close your eyes for a moment, picture a riverbank in the heat, a faint smell of smoke, a thick, sweet drink in a clay cup. The air vibrates with insects. Voices chant just out of sight. Aveda, the medical system that grows out of this culture, does not leave the plant and myth alone. It classifies and applies it. Bung, a drink. Ganja, the flowering tops. Chares, the concentrated resin. Each preparation is recorded not for fun, but for function. Pain, appetite, anxiety. These are not rumors. They are entries in a medical tradition that names indications and effects. They continue the same triad we've already traced: sacred narrative, ritual use, clinical integration. Why is this an anomaly in the official story? Because the dominant modern narrative insists that drugs are a late minus-breaking problem, an invention of decadent modernity, or at most a series of fringe practices. Yet here, more than 2 millennia ago, we see a plant woven into the center of a civilization's theology and medicine, managed by rules and classifications and ritual frameworks, not a chaotic vice. A regulated technology of the inner life. Turn west now, across desert and stone. Feel the temperature drop as the sun sets behind limestone cliffs. Sand cools quickly under your feet, the sky bleeding from gold to violet. We enter Egypt. In the long body of this civilization, one particular mummy stands out in our file: Ramses I, dead in 1213 BCE. On his embalmed remains, investigators have identified cannabis pollen. Pollen is a stubborn witness. Tiny, durable, it clings to fabrics, hair, wrappings waiting millennia to be counted. The presence of cannabis pollen on a pharaoh's mummy is not a casual detail. It places the plant within the sphere of elite treatment of the dead. Alongside this biological residue, we have a textual ghostly Ebers papers, dated to around 1550 BC, one of the oldest medical records on Earth. Within its long list of treatments, there may be a reference to cannabis used for inflammation. The identification is debated, but the possibility is on the table: a plant with anti-minus inflammatory properties applied to the suffering body in a tradition that prized balance and order. So we have, again, a dual pattern: funerary proximity at the very top of society and possible mention in a medical technical document. Sacred threshold, practical therapy. The same braid. If you listen carefully in the quiet between these cases, the steppe, the Ganges, the Nile, you can almost hear the common thread, like a low note underneath different songs. But the file isn't complete yet. We need to go to the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay to see how another cluster of cultures handled this same substance. In the first millennium BCE, in Assyrian and Babylonian records, a term appears: cunubu. It surfaces in cuneiform texts, those baked tablets that store the administrative and ritual memory of empires. The lexical link between cunubu and later words for cannabis is suggestive, and many researchers read it as a reference to the same plant. If that is true, and some argue the case strongly, then cannabis is present in the Mesopotamian archive as an item of note, worthy of inclusion in lists, recipes, or rituals. From here, a more fragile bridge extends into one of the most past texts on the planet, the Old Testament. Some scholars have proposed that a mysterious term there, Cain H. boson, might also point to cannabis. The identification is disputed, the evidence is linguistic, indirect, and fiercely argued, but the possibility itself is a kind of anomaly. If Cain H. boson does indeed refer to cannabis, then the plant sits, unnamed to most of its modern readers, inside a book that underlies vast religious and legal systems. That would mean that the same organism, now scheduled and prohibited in modern codes, once occupied a space in the symbolic and ritual framework of early Hebrew culture. Even if the identification is wrong, the debate tells us something: this plant lurks at the margins of translation, in words that resist clean modern equivalents, in shadows where sacred and profane vocabulary blur. Think of a scribe leaning over a clay tablet or a scroll by lamplight. The room smelling of oil and dust. Each sign they impress or ink is a decision about what to record, what to elevate, and what to leave silent. The plant peeks through in a word here, a turn there, a term there, like a fossil fragment protruding from eroded rock. Finally, we move to the cultures that later claim to have invented rational, secular discourse. The Greeks and the Romans. Here the record shifts in turn. In these files, cannabis appears primarily not as a sacrament, but as a material. The Greeks and Romans know it as hemp. They twist its fibers into rope and weave it into textiles. They rely on its strength. Ships ride on hempen lines, loads are lashed with it. Clothing is stitched from it. The plant is recorded not as an object of art but as an indispensably tough fiber. Yet even here, where its psychopatha flowers retreat into the background of the archive, the medical thread does not entirely disappear. In the 1st century CE, the physician Diacorsized compiles a great pharmacological work. In it, he notes hemp for rope, confirming its industrial value, but he also records something more intimate: the juice of the plant for eryches. This is not a mystical claim. It is a terse, clinical entry. This plant, this preparation, this symptom. The style is dry, but the implication is clear. Even in a world that treats hemp as a workhorse for rope and cloth, its effect on the human body is catalogued and used. If cannabis were inherently unmanageable, if its only destiny were chaos and abuse, it is hard to explain this continuous, low-minor scheme edible thread. The Romans had no shortage of substances that intoxicated. Yet in this case, the record shows a measured, note-useful fiber, specific remedy. Imagine a Roman workshop, the scrape of fiber being coned, the rhythmic thud of looms, the faint vegetal smell of processed stocks. In another part of the city, a healer presses plant juice into a patient's ear, not with reverence, not with fear, but with the pragmatic intention of easing pain. When you line these records at the Scythian gold vessels between 900 and 200 BCE, the Vedic hymns between 1500 and 500 BCE, Eming Fang as sacred, the Egyptian Polynon pharaoh who died in 1213 BCE, the possible medical note in the 1550 BC Ebers Papiers, the Assyrian and Babylonian C. UNUBU in 1st millennium BCE cuneiform, the contested Cain H. bosom in the Old Testament, and finally Diacorsized in the 1st century CE prescribing hemp juice for eryches, a pattern begins to show itself with uncomfortable clarity. Across time and geography, the plant keeps surfacing in 3 domains: the ritual handling of death and the sacred, the management of pain and disorder in the body, and the infrastructure of everyday life through fiber and rope. The anomaly is not that ancient cultures used cannabis. The anomaly is that they did so in structured ways, with rules, classes, and documented effects, while our modern framing relegates it to the edge of legality and morality, as if that were its natural place. If you are listening in the dark, notice how this pattern feels in your own body. There is a certain weight to it, like the heaviness of old rope in your hands, or the dense quiet of a burial chamber. It suggests continuity where we were told there was rupture, management where we were warned there was only chaos. And yet, somewhere after Diacorsized, after these long centuries of pragmatic and sacred use, the script changes. The same plant that had been a rope minus maker, a funeral purifier, a sacred drink, the balm for inflammation and anxiety, begins its slow migration into the category we now call drug, with all the legal and moral freight that word carries. The evidence we have just walked through does not tell us why that happened, not yet, but it does fix one thing solidly in place: full thousands of years before Prohibition, cannabis was not an outlaw. It was a documented, integrated tool in the human kit for dealing with pain, death, fear, and fabric. The question that waits for us just beyond this line of evidence is stark. If so many different civilizations, Scythian, Indian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, Roman, could treat this plant as a controlled ally, what changed in the later story that turned it into a forbidden enemy, and what else was altered, erased, or reclassified along with it? To answer that, we have to move into a different file, not a temple, not a Roman field, but a city where long mysticism slept in the same streets. In the medieval Islamic world, cannabis steps into the record under a new name with a new charge around it: hashish, the same plant, but now concentrated resin, pressed, smoked, eaten. It enters a civilization obsessed with law, text, and the fine gradations of what is permitted and what is forbidden. Imagine a courtyard after evening prayer, lamps low, the stones still warm under your feet. Men in turbans argue in a soft, relentless rhythm. Is this plant a medicine or a sin? A help to devotion or a veil over the mind? Their debates are not casual. They are case law, spelling out what can be done with the human body and soul. Within this world, another kind of testimony appears: the legend of a Sufi mystic named Haider, around 1155 of our era. In the story, he walks out from his monastery into the mountains, heavy with solitude and prayer, and finds a plant. He eats its leaves. His bloom lifts. He dances. He returns to his followers with a green secret in his hands. We cannot cross-examine a legend. We cannot put Haider on the stand. But the persistence of this story, tied explicitly to cannabis and to altered states in the service of God, tells us that by this point, the plant psychopative side is not an accident, not a side effect. It is central enough to be woven into the origin story of a mystical order. If you listen in that imagined courtyard, you can almost hear the friction between the jurist and the mystic, one counting harms and benefits, the other talking about ecstasy. The same plant suspended between them like evidence in a trial. From legend, the file shifts back to something harder: medical description. Between 1197 and 1248, a physician named Ibn al-Bayt writes. In his notes, he does what few before him have done so explicitly: he separates cannabis into varieties. One of them, he marks out with care what we would now call Cannabis Sativa for its strong psychopative properties. This is a critical exhibit, because it proves awareness of difference. Ibn al-Bayt is not speaking vaguely of hemp. He is distinguishing types, strengths, effects. It is an early pharmacological catalogue entry. This one does this to the human nervous system. Picture his desk for a moment. A narrow window, dust in the light, the scratch of a reed pen, the faint, bitter smell of dried plants. Each line he writes is both observation and classification, adding to a record that says this plant can clothe you, but it can also take you somewhere else entirely. By naming Cannabis Sativa for its potency, Ibn al-Bayt quietly undercuts the idea that strong psychopative cannabis is a modern invention, and the deliberate seeking of its mind-altering effects are already on the page centuries before any modern pharmacology. Meanwhile, in the streets below that scholars study, hashish is no longer a private experiment. It is a social phenomenon. The testimonies from Cairo in this period are blunt. Hashish is widespread. It moves through taverns, back rooms, gatherings. It is eaten, smoked, shared. Authorities grow nervous. The substance is not contained within small Sufi circles and medical treatises. It is becoming part of the daily rhythm of a great city. In 1253, the Mamluk power structure responds with fire. An order goes out: hashish to be burned, its use suppressed. Imagine the scene as an official act, not a moral anecdote. Bags and bricks of resin piled in a square, flames taking them one by one, thick, sweet smoke rising over stone. The record of that burning is important. It shows that by 1253, the plant is significant enough socially, economically, spiritually, that the state believes it must intervene. This is not about a marginal curiosity. It is about a substance capable of shaping behavior at scale. And yet, even as the Mamluks try to erase hashish from the streets, another story about cannabis is being written about the Islamic world from the outside. Enter Marco Polo, and with him, the legend of the assassins. In his reports, this Western traveler ties the Nizar Ismail as a secretive sect already feared for political killings to hashish. The tale is vivid. Used drugged with cannabis, transported to artificial paradises, then sent out as fanatics convinced they have glimpsed heaven. The modern historical verdict on this story is cold. Most researchers see it as propaganda, a kind of psychological weapon to paint a political enemy as not just dangerous, but depraved, irrational, drug-addled. There is no solid internal record from the Nizaris themselves that confirms this ritualized hashish use. This contrast matters. On one side, we have Islamic legal and medical text wrestling seriously with cannabis, classifying varieties, debating harm, documenting suppression. On the other, we have a foreign narrative that uses the same plant as a brush to paint a whole group as monsters. Stand with me, just for a moment, in the imagined mountain stronghold of that sect. Stone walls, cold air, a silence broken only by distant voices. Whatever truly happened there, the hashish legend becomes a tool. It shows how quickly a plant can be turned into an accusation, how easily a substance can be used to explain away political complexity. Already a pattern begins to emerge: the same plant as medicine, sacrament, street drug and smear. The category of falls into depends less on its chemistry and more on who's telling the story. While jurists argue and travelers embellish, trade does what it always does: it ignores borders. Caravans and ships carry cannabis south and west, and we find a new entry in the record: Africa. Here the plant does not arrive through conquest or decree, but through traders moving along ancient routes, adding seeds and resin to the cargo of salt, cloth, and metals. The physical proof lies not in myth, but in residue. Around 1320, in what we now know as Ethiopia, pipes appear in the archaeological layer. When their interiors are tested, the chemical fingerprint is clear cannabis. Imagine the excavation wrench: reed earth cut cleanly to a vertical wall, a pipe emerging from the soil, fragile, crusted, waiting centuries to be touched again. When the residue inside is finally analyzed, it fixes a date. By about 1320, people here are burning and inhaling cannabis. This is not a diffusion of ideas alone. It is a diffusion of practice, of specific techniques for using the plant's psychoactive properties. The same resin that alarms Cairo's authorities has found its way into African bowls, into lungs and rituals and stories we have barely begun to reconstruct. The plant does not recognize the lines on our maps. It follows human desire and trade, embedding itself in new societies just as those societies begin to be pulled into a global web. Far to the north and west, another branch of the cannabis record is growing, almost completely detached from hashish and mysticism. In Europe, the focus is brutally practical fiber. Hemp becomes a structural material, the quiet backbone of ships and sails. The word canvas itself traces back to this plant, echoing in every stretched sail and painter's cloth. Picture a shipyard on a cold morning. The slap of water against hulls, the sting of tar and salt in the air. Men hauling coils of hemp rope so thick they leave grooves in the skin. Each rope, each sail, each caulking fiber has a lineage that runs back to Cannabis Sativa. The case files here are not poems or medical notes, but naval inventories and state edicts. Vikings lash their ships with hemp rope and hoist hemp's sails to cross rough seas. Later, states like England go further, mandating hemp cultivation, not as suggestion, but as requirement. Their fleets, their trade, their power depend on this plant's tensile strength. Notice what is missing from these European entries: almost any mention of intoxication. For these societies in this period, cannabis is not a mind-altering substance. It is infrastructure. It is as strategic as iron, as wood, as pitch. Hemp here is not feared. It is enforced. Fields of it wave under grey skies because the crown has said they must. When ocean-crossing voyagers begin to stitch continents together, hemp sails across the Atlantic not as contraband, but as standard equipment. Columbus's ships are held together and driven forward by hemp rope rigging, sailcloth. Without it, the voyages that rewired the world's geography do not happen in the form we know. Every gust of wind filling those sails is, in a sense, moving through cannabis fiber. Follow that line west, and you land in the soil of what will be called America. In the 1600 seconds, at Jamestown in Virginia, hemp is among the first crops forced into this new colonial economy. Again, it is a requirement, not an indulgence. Rope, sail, cloth, all demand it. The record becomes personal when we read the names: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin. These are not marginal farmers. They are central figures in the story we are told about a nation's birth. And yet, on their land and in their workshops, they cultivate and process hemp for fiber. Imagine one of those fields at dawn, tall stalks. A figure moving between rows, checking growth. The crack and rustle as plants are cut. Dried, broken fibers separated from woody core. Hand-stained, muscles tired. This is cannabis as labor, as economy, as the quiet material undercurrent of political revolution. The irony is hard to ignore. The same plant that will later be painted as foreign, dangerous, associated with marginalized groups, is woven literally into the lives and fortunes of the men who wrote laws and declarations. It helps sail the ships. It ties the cargo. It clothes the workers. In this file, too, there is almost no mention of intoxication. No great panic, no moral crusade, just acreage, yield, fiber, quality. Cannabis is a crop, a necessity, not a threat. Set these strands side by side now. In one column, Sufi legends. Ibn el-Baytos precise notes on Cannabis Sativa, Cairo's Hashish dens and the Memluk burning order of 1253, Marco Polo's Tales of the Assassins, Ethiopian pipes around 1320 with cannabis residue still clinging to their walls. In another European shipyards, Viking voyagers under hemp sails, royal mandates to grow hemp, Columbus's hemp-prigged crossings, colonial fields at Jamestown in the 1600s, and Washington, Jefferson, Franklin quietly working with this plant as a staple of their world. Same species, same basic chemistry, to very different social identities. On one side, a substance debated in terms of sin and sanctity, used to alter consciousness, targeted by bans, and twisted into propaganda. On the other, a strategic resource so vital it is compelled by law, its psychopative potential almost completely ignored, or at least absent from the surviving record. If you stand very still in the middle of this split, you can feel the tension. A single plant carrying to futures one as sacred, suspect, and eventually criminalize the other as essential, invisible infrastructure. Somewhere ahead of us, those futures will collide. And when they do, the decision about which identity wins will tell us less about the plant and more about the kind of world that needs it to be either rope or crime. We are not there yet, but every entry in this evidence chain heightens the question. When the same organism can be harvest, law, medicine, weapon, and myth, what exactly are we outlawing when we outlaw? And whose memory are we protecting or erasing when we decide which of its faces is allowed to remain in the light? The next entry in the file opens in a place that, at first glance, looks nothing like a temple or a tomb, not a pyramid, not a stone circle, a hospital ward somewhere in India in the 1832. Picture yourself at the edge of a narrow bed in that ward, humid air, the faint, sour smell of disinfectant and sweat, oil lamps throwing long, shivering shadows on plaster walls. At the bedside, a glass bottle, brown and cloudy, with a handwritten label, a physician weighing every drop as if it were a blade. The label reads Cannabis. Between 1833 and 1840, a young doctor named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy begins writing a series of reports that, if you read them now, feel less like casual case notes and more like controlled detonations in the official story. His patients are not mild cases. The record lists rabies, rheumatism, epilepsy, tetanus, conditions that, in that time and place, often meant agony, paralysis, or death. The file says he does something quietly radical. He administers preparations of cannabis to these patients and observes. This is not ritual incense in a burial pit, not a cloud in a Scythian tent. It is drops of a plant extract measured into a spoon, brought to the lips of someone convulsing, someone burning with fever, someone whose muscles are locked in a tetanic arch. Imagine the sound of those convulsions beginning to ease the scrape of a wooden chair as the physician leans forward, watching, the hush that falls over the room when a symptom that should have escalated instead begins to soften at the edges. O'Shaughnessy records what he sees. The evidence he sends back to the West describes reductions in spasms, relief of pain, periods of calm where there should have been none. He is careful, methodical, not promising miracles, but he is also clearly impressed enough to keep going, case after case, year after year. On paper, this should not be a surprise. For thousands of years in China, India, and the Islamic world, we have already seen this plant used for pain, for convulsions, for the wild storms of the nervous system. The archive is full of that testimony. And yet, in the industrializing West of the 1830s, cannabis is almost absent from the medical record. That is the fracture this entry exposes. A colonial doctor goes east, listens, if only indirectly, to older traditions, tests the plant using the methods of his own culture, and sends back a stack of evidence saying, in effect, this works, at least sometimes. And it works on conditions we fear most. Within a decade, the echo of that file has crossed oceans. By the 1840s, the evidence trail shifts from a single ward to a whole network of counters and shelves. In Western pharmacies, glass bottles with printed labels begin to appear. Tincture of cannabis, extract of Indian hemp. Imagine the muted clink of those bottles as an apothecary arranges them in a row, clear alcohol laced with plant resin, catching the light in shades of amber and green. A mortar still dusted with the faint, bitter minor-smelling residue of ground herb. This is exhibit after exhibit of quiet normalization. The record from this decade as blunt cannabis tinctures become widely available, not experimental curiosities, but catalog minus listed medicines. And what are they used for? The file lists Spain, muscular spasms, migraines, the rigors and tearing pains of childbirth. In other words, the same domains we saw on the other side of the world: pain that will not yield, muscles that will not unclench, storms in the brain that make language and memory flicker. If you map this against the ancient testimonies, a pattern snaps into focus. Shanlangius pharmacopoeia, Avederic recipes, medieval physicians in the Islamic world, all pointing the plant at the same categories of human suffering. Now 18 or 19 centuries later, Western doctors, often without fully reading those older records, arrive at almost identical uses, independent lines of trial and error converging on the same target. It does not prove that cannabis is a perfect or a harmless medicine, but it does suggest something more than superstition is at work. Imagine for a moment the patients on the receiving end. A woman in the throes of labor, pulse pounding in her neck, the air of the small room hot and wet with breath. A midwife measures out a dark, slightly bitter tincture, the glass dropper cold between her fingers. A man with a migraine that has hammered behind his eyes for 3 days, light like knives, now sitting in the dim back room of a pharmacy, swallowing a dose with the slow dread of someone who has already tried too many useless things. For both, this plant is not a joke, not a crime, not a symbol. It is one of the only levers they have. Here, in the 1840s, the official narrative would later claim that cannabis is a fringe intoxicant, a danger to public morals, with no accepted medical use. But the pharmacy ledgers, the advertisements, the physician's guides from this era function as counter-minus testimony. They list it plainly among the tools of the trade. Then the file takes a sideways turn, because while the plant is entering the medical mainstream in the West, another, more shadowed identity is Rominus emerging as well. We move now to the 1850s through the 1880s. Gaslit cities, narrow streets gleaming with recent rain. Behind certain doors in Europe and the United States, another kind of room is opening. Hashish parlors. Picture the air inside one of these rooms, thick with curling smoke. The sweet resinous scent of concentrated cannabis hanging just above the furniture, clinging to drapes and hair. Voices low, words stretching and looping as perception bends. A spoon stirring something dark and sticky into coffee or chocolate. The record says that in this era, such parlors appear in major cities on both sides of the Atlantic. They are not mass institutions, but they leave a paper trail. Newspaper reports, literary recollections, police notes. In Paris, one of these circles acquires a name the club des has his chins. On the roster Baudelaire, Cafetier, writers and artists who will later describe, with unnerving precision, the shifts in time, color, and thought that come with heavy doses of hashish. Men who approach the plant as a deliberate probe into altered states, not as background indulgence. If the Scythian steam tent was one of our early exhibits for cannabis as a vehicle into other modes of consciousness, these rooms are a 19th-century continuation of that file. The continuity is hard to ignore. In one era, warriors sitting in a felt tent around glowing stones and fragrant smoke. In another, poets sinking into upholstered chairs under gaslight, exhaling clouds that catch the glow in slow, iridescent layers, different costumes, same chemistry. To the authorities and moralists of the time, these parlors look like threats to order, to productivity, to the emerging ideal of the rational, disciplined citizen. To the participants, they are laboratories of the mind. And here again we see the split identity tightening. On one side, labeled bottles in respectable pharmacies, doses calculated and prescribed. On the other, dens of sensation, whispered invitation, scandal. The same plant threaded through both. If you are listening in the dark, you might feel the way these dual narratives complicate any attempt to speak of cannabis as one thing. But the archive has one more twist for this century. For all the promise recorded in hospital wards and pharmacies, for all the fascination playing out in salons and parlors, cannabis fails a test that is about to reshape medicine itself. The problem is not that the plant does nothing. The problem is that it does too many things, too unpredictably, on a timeline that does not obey the emerging rules of industrial precision. Doctors complain about variable potency. One bottle of tincture seems strong, the next, from another batch or supplier, seems weak. To drops that barely affect one patient may leave another drowsy for hours. The onset is slow. A dose swallowed must pass through stomach and liver before its full force is felt. That might mean 30 minutes. It might mean 2 hours. Imagine being a physician in that moment of transition, standing between eras. You have a convulsing child in front of you. On one side of your trace it's a tincture of cannabis, its history long, its effects real but erratic, its timing uncertain. On the other sits a precise vial of injectable morphine, its dose measured in milligrams, its onset fast and chart-able. Nearby, a tablet of aspirin, synthesized in 1897, with standardized strength, predictable relief for certain kinds of pain. A new kind of medicine is emerging, one built on synthetic drugs like aspirin and on powerful, targeted agents like injectable morphine. Substances manufactured in factories, their molecules identical from batch to batch, their actions plotted on neat curves. Compared to these, whole minus plant cannabis looks messy. Too many active components, not yet isolated or understood. Too much variation between plants, between harvests, too dependent on factors no one has fully quantified: soil, weather, storage, method of preparation. For a culture moving toward a model of medicine that prizes standardization, reproducitus light, and speed, this is more than an inconvenience. It is a liability. The record shows the result. By the end of the 19th century, as aspirin's year 1897 marks a turning point, and injectable morphine becomes a staple of serious clinical practice, cannabis, the nabised, begins to slip from the center of Western pharmacopoeia, not because it has been conclusively proven useless, but because it does not fit the new template. Imagine the apothecary's shelf decades after O'Shaughnessy's first reports, dust on the older bottles, newer, brighter labels crowding the front rows bearing the names of synthetic compounds. The faint, plant-minus heavy smell of the cannabis tincture receding behind the sharper, more clinical sense of refined chemicals. In earlier ages, variability was accepted as part of working with the living substances. A shaman, a village healer, an herbalist understood that no two plants were identical and adjusted by feel, by experience, by watching the patient. In this new age, that kind of intimate, iterative knowledge is devalued. Instead, the ledger prefers numbers, dosages, curves of response. Cannabis, in its 19th-century medical guise, stands right at that fault line. Its 1830 case files in India, its 1840 seconds spread across Western pharmacies, its 1850 seconds, 1880 seconds presence in hashish parlors and literary circles, all led up to a simple, stark outcome by the century's end. A medicine that has followed humanity for millennia is quietly outcompeted, not because its effects are imaginary, but because they are too complex, too slow, too entangled with the variability of nature to survive in a world that is learning to love pure, fast, single-minus molecule answers. The plant does not disappear, but in the official medical record, its voice lowers, then fades, replaced by the sharper, more authoritative tones of aspirin and morphine. The question that will haunt the next entries is simple and heavy. When a culture chooses speed and precision over complexity and slowness, what else gets erased along with the difficult plant? And in that silence, what grows in its place? In the early 20th century, something does grow in that silence. Not a new medicine, a new story. It begins at a border with trains and footsteps and dust. Picture this: the year is just after 1910th. The Mexican Revolution sends families north, across a line on a map that is not a wall, on a map that is not a wall, just rails and river and checkpoint. In their pockets and memory they carry songs, foods, and a habit, rolling the dried flowering tops of cannabis into cigarettes, smoking it recreationally at the end of a long day. The plant is the same species that once moved as fiber and tincture through respectable ledgers, but in this file, in this place it gets a new name: marijuana. The record does not show a council of elders deciding on that word. It shows newspapers and local officials picking it up, repeating it, using the foreign minor-sounding syllables as a label that feels safely other. A plant long known in English as hemp or cannabis acquires a quiet one known in English as hemp. Almost overnight, a new alias, one that can be entangled with fear of newcomers rather than with centuries of rope and medicine. You can almost hear the shift, like a click in the machinery. Same plant, different word, different resonance. If you listen closely in those border towns, the wind carries two languages. In one, this is just a plant that helps you relax, laugh, forget the weight of war. In the other, it slowly becomes a problem looking for a crime. The official line in those early years is not yet a full prohibition. It is more of a tightening, a narrowing of tolerance, but the pattern is clear in the case notes. Mexican immigration surges after the revolution. Recreational smoking spreads in fields, in worker housing, in low minus-wage districts the established citizens already fear. And as anti-minus Mexican sentiment hardens, the plant is drafted as evidence, not evidence of its chemistry, evidence of them. On paper, the claims look clinical. Off paper, they are anything but. Local authorities begin to link marijuana to violence, to moral decay, to the supposed instability of newcomers. Each arrest, each incident, becomes an exhibit cited in the next report, the next speech, the next law, no matter how thin the connection, no matter how many other factors are ignored. In 1913, California moves first. The statute books for that year show a decisive entry about criminalizing marijuana. No great fanfare, no nationwide debate. Just a line of ink that makes one state the first in the United States to turn this plant, in its smoke form, from a medical curiosity into contraband. The legal text does not say that it's about immigrants. It talks about public safety, about order. But when you trace the circumstances, who is targeted, whose neighborhoods are raided, whose habits are suddenly felonies, the outline of prejudice sits there like a watermark in the paper. Imagine the feel of that paper, thick, official, the kind that cracks slightly when folded, on its surface neutral language. Inside the culture that produced it, a quiet decision about who belongs and who does not. This is how erasure often begins. Not with bonfires of books, but with a reclassification in a code. Then, in 1930, the story tightens again. Enter Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. His office is small at first, a bureaucratic corner in the expanding federal state. But he understands something about stories. He understands that to grow his bureau's power, he needs a threat that feels big, simple, and terrifying. Cannabis, still widely remembered as hempen medicine, is messy as a target. It is used by farmers, doctors, sailors, mill workers. Its record is scattered. Tinctures in pharmacies, ropes in shipyards, birdseed in barns. But marijuana, that newer, darker name, is easier to focus. Anslinger's files begin to fill with clippings, Sworn statements, selectively assembled case reports. Over and over, they press the same association. Marijuana with crime, marijuana with insanity, marijuana with minority groups whose existence already troubles the comfort of the majority. This is not an organic evolution of public concern. It is a campaign. From his desk, with its buzzing fluorescent light and the smell of carbon paper, letters go out to newspapers, to local police, to civic organizations. The narrative is always the same. This plant drives people mad. It unleashes hidden violence. It is spreading through just clubs, border towns, marginalized communities. The complexity of dosage, setting, prior mental health, and social stress, all the variables any honest physician would list, are shaved away. What remains is a weaponized story, the marijuana menace. If you could listen in on those typewriters, the clatter would be relentless. Each keystroke another word that pushes the plant further from its earlier identities, deeper into the realm of moral panic. By 1936, the campaign acquires a moving image. A film appears reefer madness. It is officially just entertainment, a cautionary tale. Unofficially, it is pure propaganda, echoing the Bureau's talking points almost line by line. In harsh black and white, teenage experimenters are shown descending almost instantly into violence, insanity, and ruin after a few puffs of marijuana. The evidence this film offers is not data, not controlled observation. It is theater, wild eyes, manic laughter, sudden crimes. But for many who see it, especially in towns where no one remembers cannabis as a common medicine, it becomes their first exposure to the plant. For a lens smeared thick with fear, think of the experience of watching it in a darkened 1930s theater. The air is heavy with tobacco smoke. The projector rattles softly behind you. On the screen, the plant is no longer a fiber, a seed, a tincture in a brown bottle. It is pure chaos compressed into 90 minutes. This is how memory is overwritten, not by erasing old images, but by drowning them in louder, more vivid ones. Under that pressure, Congress acts. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act has passed. Officially, it does not ban cannabis outright. It imposes strict taxes and regulatory requirements on anyone who grows, distributes, or prescribes it. In practice, the obligations are so burdensome, the penalties from the steps so severe, that for almost everyone, it functions as a prohibition. The legislative record shows objections. The American Medical Association raises concerns. Physicians argue that this will interfere with their ability to use cannabis as a therapeutic tool. Representatives of the hemp industry warn that conflating industrial hemp with psychoactive marijuana will strangle a valuable agricultural resource. These testimonies are there in the transcripts, like faint dissenting lines in the sediment. They are heard, then quietly set aside. What carries the day is the atmosphere of fear cultivated over the previous decade. The case files Anslinger has fed to committees, the headlines, the films, the chemistry of the plant, its long record in Materium Edica, its role in rope and saline paper. All of that weighs less in that moment than the recent stories of madness and crime. Imagine the ink drying on that text. Somewhere, a doctor locks away old bottles of cannabis tincture. A farmer who once grew hemp along with other crops hears that he now faces a maze of taxes and forms and inspections. An entire relationship, thousands of years long, is reduced to a bureaucratic hazard. Yet even at the moment of most intense condemnation, reality refuses to stay in one category. Just a few years later, between 1940 to 1945, the same federal government that has effectively banned cannabis finds itself in a different kind of crisis. Total war. Ships need ropes, parachutes need cord, military supply chains need reliable, strong fiber that can be produced domestically. Synthetic alternatives are not yet adequate. Its durability, its growth speed, its usefulness for cordage suddenly becomes strategically essential again. And so, another entry appears in the record, the Hemp for Victory campaign. The very apparatus that had painted the plant as madness now encourages farmers to grow it. Specifically for the war effort, the messaging is careful. This is not about marijuana, the demon of the 1937 hearings. This is about hemp, a loyal industrial crop. The split identity, one plant, two stories becomes glaring. Picture a wartime field in the early 1940 seconds. Rows of hemp sway in the wind, leaves whispering in the same pattern they always have. The sun is hot on the backs of workers harvesting stalks whose fiber will be twisted into ropes that cross oceans. In official pamphlets, this is framed as patriotic duty. In law, the Marijuana Tax Act still stands. The contradiction is simply managed. On one page, the plant is a threat to youth and sanity. On another, it is a strategic asset. The deeper problem is not the botany. It is the way language and law have sliced the plant's identity into incompatible halves. When you look at this sequence as a single file, Mexican immigration after 1910, the emergence of the term marijuana, California S. 1913 criminalization, and Slinger's 1913-30 ascent and his propaganda are linking the plant to crime and sanity. And minority groups, the lurid images of reefer madness in 1936, the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act effectively banning cannabis despite American Medical Association and hemp industry objections, and then, abruptly, the 1940 to 1945 Hemp for Victory campaign. You do not see a coherent public health strategy. You see a story being engineered, then selectively suspended when material needs intrude. The official explanation offered at the time is simple. This is about protecting the public from a dangerous drug, but the pattern suggests something more tangled: anxiety about immigrants, about changing cultures, about economic shifts, a young federal agency seeking purpose, a willingness to ignore long-line standing users when they conflict with a convenient fear. If you press your ear to this layer of history, there is a particular kind of silence. It is not empty. It is full of things not said in the hearings, not acknowledged in the films, not printed in the headlines. No one in those rooms stands up and says, "We are afraid of losing control over who counts as us, so we will turn a plant into a symbol and outline." No one admits we tolerate the plant when we need its fiber, and we need its fiber. Condemn it when we need a scapegoat. Instead, the record shows a sequence of necessary measures, reasonable taxes, urgent concerns, phrases that sound almost soothing on the page, like soft fabric hiding a hard edge. And that is the mystery this era leaves us with. How does a plant move in a few decades from medicine and material to menace and then back to quiet wartime necessity without its chemistry changing? Only its story. What does it reveal about us that such a shift can be driven less by new evidence than by new fears? And if this is how we treated a plant that had lived alongside us for 12,000 years, what else in our world has been reclassified in the dark, not by what it is, but by who we decide should be associated with it? After the woo, the files change tone. The memos about farm quotas and rope give way to something softer on the surface, more cultural, more atmospheric. But underneath, the stakes have not changed at all. We are still deciding who is allowed to sit at the table of respectable society, and cannabis is still the utensil we mock them with. Picture yourself now in a different kind of archive. Not a courthouse, but a small smoke-filled room in the late 1920 seconds. A horn section warming up in the half-minus dark. The lights are low, the air thick. The cymbals brushing like distant train. In the corners between solos, a thin stream of smoke rises, sweet and unfamiliar to most of white America, but entirely ordinary to the musicians who live on these night shifts. The record of this period does not come in the form of statutes at first. It comes as police reports, scattered interviews, moral panics in local newspapers. Cannabis use spread through to culture in the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, entangled with black musicians' migrations, and the nightlife that terrified those who preferred their world quiet and segregated. By the 1950 seconds, that same plant appears in another file, the notebooks and travelogues of the Beat Generation. Coffee houses instead of clubs, blank pages, typewriters, and restless young men and women chasing altered states as a form of protest against conformity. Different music, same smoke curling under the door, and then the 1960 seconds arrive, and the sound changes again. Now, it is not just in basements and back rooms, it is on campuses, in parks, at festivals. Marijuana becomes a kind of unofficial flag of the counterculture. In the surveillance photos and government reports of the era, you can trace its presence: long hair, guitars, protest signs, and somewhere in the background, a joint passing from hand to hand, like a quiet statement that another world is possible. The plant itself has not changed. But look at the pattern in these three entries: just culture in the 1920 seconds, the beat generation in the 1950 seconds, and the counterculture in the 1960 seconds. In each turn, cannabis is not simply a substance, it is a shorthand for people who are not where they are supposed to be in the social order. If you listen carefully, beneath the music and the chanting crowds, you can almost hear the clatter of typewriter keys in distant offices, drafting a new response. By 1970, that response is formalized into the central exhibit of this era, the Controlled Substances Act. In one column of that law, marijuana is placed in Schedule I. That classification is blunt: high abuse potential, no medical use. It is a single line in a long statute, but it does something extraordinary. With a stroke of the pen, it not only criminalizes possession and distribution. On a federal level, it officially erases thousands of years of recorded medicinal use from the plant's legal identity. Imagine the contrast as a stack on a table. On one side, scrolls, pharmacopoeia s, handwritten prescriptions from the 1840 seconds, the testimonies of physicians in India who used cannabis for pain, spasms, migraines, and childbirth. 12,000 years of cultivation, food, fiber, and medicine. Pages stained with ink and oil, corners worn from use. On the other side, a freshly printed federal schedule, one page among many, stating that this same plant has no medical use. The paper is crisp, the language is sterile, the decision is absolute. The official story says this was a neutral scientific judgment, that experts reviewed the evidence and decided dispassionately that cannabis belonged in the same category as the most dangerous, least useful drugs known. But look again at the timing. This schedule arrives at the end of the 1960 seconds, exactly when marijuana has become emblematic of opposition to a wall of civil rights marches, of a generation that does not want to inherit the world as it is. The classification describes a molecule, but it also constrains a movement. And then in 1971 the rhetoric sharpens. President Nixon announces what he calls a war on drugs. Publicly, it is framed as a necessary defense protecting communities from addiction, restoring law and order. The footage from the time shows podiums, flags, a leader promising to be tough on crime. The microphones gleam under the lights, the applause is controlled and polite. The internal record, though, holds a different kind of testimony. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's closest advisors, describes the logic behind this war in terms that strip away the careful language. According to that later account, drugs were not just a health concern, they were a tool. By targeting marijuana, the administration could target two groups at once. The anti-war left in black communities. He describes it plainly: you cannot make it illegal to be against war or to be black, but you can make it illegal to use the plant associated with them, and then you can raid their meetings, arrest their leaders, and discredit their movements in the press. One quote does not rewrite the entire era, but as an exhibit in this case file, it is hard to ignore. It suggests that the war on drugs, announced as a neutral campaign against a substance, also served as a very precise instrument of social control. Notice the symmetry. In the 1930 seconds, cannabis was linked in official rhetoric to Mexican immigrants and jazz musicians, turned into marijuana and demonized to manage fear about borders and racial mixing. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, the same plant is linked to students, activists, and black communities, and the response has escalated to a declared war. The molecule is stable. The story mutates depending on who is holding it. Yet, even in this period of tightening law, you see fractures in the narrative. Just 3 years after the Controlled Substances Act, in 1973, the state of Oregon becomes the first in the United States to decriminalize marijuana. Not legalize, but reduce penalties for possession. It is a quiet entry in the ledger compared to presidential speeches, but it marks the beginning of a countercurrent, local authorities deciding that the federal war has gone too far, that the punishment no longer matches the behavior. Picture a small state capitol building under gray clouds, fluorescent lights buzzing in committee rooms while legislators debate grams and fines instead of decades in prison. The air smells of coffee and old paper. They are not ending the war, but they are dulling one of its blades. Around the same time, on the national stage, President Carter expresses support for decriminalization. Again, this does not become law in the sweeping way the Controlled Substances Act did, but the fact that a sitting president would publicly lean toward reducing penalties shows that even within the establishment, the absolute language of Schedule I is beginning to sound strained. The case file for the 1972, then, is not simple. On one side, a plant classified at the federal level as having no medical use and high abuse potential, wrapped in the language of war enforced by raids and arrests, disproportionately falling on the same communities that had long been marked as other. On the other, individual states and some national voices beginning to question whether this categorization is honest, effective, or just. As the calendar turns to the 1982, another shift occurs, and this one is both more polished and more punitive. The Reagan era takes the war on drugs and gives it a new aesthetic. The language moved from policy briefings to television sets. Slogans appear: just say no. You can almost see the bright studio lights, the carefully staged living rooms, the reassuring, parental tone telling children to reject drugs and, by implication, everything that has been associated with them in the last decades. But beneath the soft minus-focused public messaging, the legal architecture hardened. Two key entries define this period: the Anti-Minus Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988. These are not mere statements of disapproval. They increase penalties significantly. They introduce and expand mandatory minimum sentences that remove judicial discretion. No matter the nuance of the case, no matter the story of the person standing before the bench, the language in these acts is numerical and unyielding quantities linked to years, thresholds that once crossed trigger automatic prison terms. They do not differentiate between the jazz musician, the college student, the street dealer, and the person caught in the wrong tar at the wrong time. Weight and category become destiny. The residue of these policies can be read in demographic tables and prison rosters. Although the statutes are written in race-neutral language, the impact is not neutral. The evidence shows that the burden of enforcement falls disproportionately on minority communities, continuing on deepening the pattern hinted at in earlier decades. Imagine the fluorescent hum of a processing facility at 3 Concrete floors cold underfoot, the clank of doors, the shuffle of chains. Lives redirected for possession of a plant that, not long before, grew openly in fields as rope and medicine, that elders still remember as a tincture in a brown bottle behind the counter. From the 1920s to the 1980s, the sequences start when you line up the exhibits. First, Cannabisant Wind with jazz culture in the 1920s, 30s, a companion to black creativity and nocturnal freedom. Then, a tool of the beat generation in the 1950s, a quiet rebellion against post-war conformity. Then, a banner of the 1960s counterculture, visible in every photograph that made authorities nervous about their hold on the future. In response, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, Schedule I status declaring no medical use. The war on drugs in 1971, enforcement targeting not just behaviors but communities and political opponents, as later suggested by Ehrlichman's 1990 for testimony, followed by a small but significant crack, Reagan's 1973 decriminalization, and Carter's support for a softer approach, and finally, the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Just say no on the surface. The Anti-Minus Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1986 and 1918 precisions and locking minimums that fall hardest on those who were already carrying the heaviest weight of earlier policies. When you run your fingers along this sequence, it feels less like a random evolution of drug policy and more like a tuned instrument, adjusted again and again to play the same underlying note control. The plant is constant. The chemistry is constant. What shifts over and over is which group is linked to it in the public imagine, and what level of punishment that association justifies. And if this is how we treated a plant whose seeds and fibers had fed, clothed, and healed us for millennia, then what exactly does the law measure in these decades? The danger of the substance, or the anxieties of a society watching its own reflection change, and choosing once more to break the mirror instead of listening to what it shows? Until the next night, rest well. The last chapter of the file we opened together ended with policy and punishment, with words spoken at podiums, signatures on acts, lives diverted into cells. Now, the record shifts from courtrooms and campaign slogans to a fluorescent minus-lit lab bench, a clear vial, and a molecule that has been in human lungs and livers for thousands of years, but never before in a bottle with a label. In 1964, Raphael Mitrulam isolates delta-9 tetrafocanogenable, THC. That single entry in the logbook is an inflection point. For the first time, the psychopative fingerprint of cannabis is separated from the plant's tangled chemistry and held up to the light on its own. Picture a glass and pal between forceps, the faint smell of solvent, the quiet hum of a refrigerator cycling on in the corner. On paper, this looks ordinary. One more compound purified, one more structured run in neat hexagons and lines. But laid against the centuries of fear we just walk through, this is more than chemistry. It is the first hard admission, in the clean language of science, that the plant's power is specific, measurable, and not just a moral panic or a listicle haze. And that admission opens a new file, because once you have the molecule, the next question is simple: where does it land? By 1988, the answer begins to take shape. Researchers identify what they call the C-bone receptor, a tiny protein gate embedded in the membranes of neurons tuned with uncanny precision to respond to THC. 3 numbers 1988. One receptor C-bone, not in the plant, in us. The anomaly deepens in 1993, when another gate is logged, CB2. Different distribution, different emphasis, but part of the same hidden architecture. To receptors 5 years apart, both waiting for a key that looks very much like THC. If cannabis is just an intruder, a foreign invader that accidentally hijacks our brains, why are the locks shaped exactly to its most famous key? The record does not stop there. In 1992, a new entry appears in Undademy, an internal, human-made molecule that binds to these same receptors. A year without symbolism, just digits on a page, but the name chosen for the compound carries a whisper from a word for bliss. Later, another internal messenger is added to the list to -AG. Together, these form the first clear outline of what is now called the endocannabinoid system. Not lith, not metaphor, a distributed web of receptors and signaling molecules that helps regulate homeostasis, the body's shifting balance between states, pain perception, mood, appetite, immune function. The small, constant adjustments that keep a human organism inside the narrow band where life feels possible. Imagine a control board in low light, dials nudged up or down, a little less pain, a little more calm, a little more hunger after an illness. Fine grained corrections made in silence. The unsettling part is not that such a system exists. The unsettling part is that it was hidden in plain flesh for as long as our species has walked and cultivated and punished, and only revealed itself after we chased a stigmatized plant down to the level of individual atoms. It does not prove that we evolved for cannabis, or that cannabis evolved for us, but at the very least, it suggests the relationship between this plant and our species is older and more intimate than any law book admits. And as this internal circuitry emerges in the scientific record, another kind of testimony is being written in hospital rooms and small apartments. The medical marijuana movement does not start in a boardroom or a pharmaceutical company's patent office. It starts with bodies in crisis, AIDS patients who cannot keep food down, cancer patients nauseated and wasting away from chemotherapy, people for whom the standard pharmacy shelves have run out of answers. The exhibit here is not a molecule. It is a human figure, thin and shivering, finally able to eat after smoking a plant that officially has no accepted medical use. Fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the slow beeping of a monitor, a paper cup with pills on a tray that have already failed. In 1996, California's Proposition 215 records a fracture in the legal bedrock, the first state-level legalization of cannabis for medical use. On one axis, federal law still screened schedule, a high abuse potential, no accepted medical role. On another, a state electorate quietly carves out an exception to that judgment, driven not by theory, but by testimony from bedsides. Once again, the pattern emerges: official story on one layer, lived reality on another. Parallel to this, a different route is taken through the same terrain: pharmaceutical cannabinoid. In 1985, Marinol, a synthetic form of THC, is approved as a legal, prescribable drug. Later, Sativex, a spray containing THC and CBD, and DPID-ILX, a purified CBD preparation, approved in 2018, join the roster. The file here is neat dosages, clinical trials brand named. Many regulators and physicians are more comfortable with this path, a single compound, or a tightly controlled combination, in a known dose. No smoke, no cultural baggage. But listen carefully to the stories from patients who have access to both the prescription bottle and the plant itself. Over and over, you hear a phrase that doesn't appear in any statute: the sense that whole minus plant cannabis feels different. That relief comes not only from CBD in isolation, but from a chorus of compounds working together. One unsettling interpretation is that in our rush to domesticate this plant into a standard pharmaceutical, we amputated parts of its complexity. Marinol, Sativex, EPIDIX, each an exhibit of what happens when we extract a single note from a chord and treat it as the entire sum. While medicine rise to fit cannabis into the existing template, another tide rises outside the clinic. In 2012, Colorado and Washington become the first jurisdictions to legalize cannabis for recreational use, building state-regulated markets with licensing, quality controls, and taxation. Picture a cold evening, a line of people outside a newly legal dispensary, breath misting in the air, security glass reflecting street altered. On paper, this is yet another policy experiment. In the deeper record, it is something stranger: the same substance once used as a pretext to imprison, now sold under bright lights, with barcodes and tax stamped, by the same state that once called it a scourge. The early outcomes are not what many of the loudest opponents predicted. Youth use, by the recorded numbers, remains largely unchanged. Adult use increases, tax revenue becomes substantial. In one state, Colorado, the figure reaches roughly $300 million in 20 alone. The black market shrinks, but does not vanish. It recedes into corners where regulation is weakest. Adapts persists. The evidence here does not say legalization is without cost, but it does fracture the older narrative that availability must equal chaos, that the only choices are total prohibition or societal collapse. Instead, a more complex picture forms. Trade-offs, adjustments, a shifting gray zone between legal storefronts and stubborn illicit supply. Above this shifting state-level landscape, federal law remains unmoved. Marijuana stays locked in Schedule I. On that level of the file, cannabis is still defined as having no accepted medical use, regardless of what any state list of qualifying conditions might record. This creates a structural anomaly: businesses that are legal under state codes but treated as criminal enterprises, or at least as pariahs, under federal banking and tax rules. Cash miners, heavy operations in an age of digital finance. complex tax burdens that other industries did not bear. By 2025, state legalization has spread to nearly half of the United States, but the federal classification lags behind, like a map that refuses to update even as cities shift, rivers change course, coastlines flood. Between the lines of these laws, another project emerges: social equity. Programs designed to address the disproportionate impact of prohibition on minority communities, prior convictions expunged or reduced. Priority in licensing given, in some jurisdictions, to those from neighborhoods most targeted during the height of the drug war. These efforts are imperfect, contested, unevenly implemented, but their mere existence is an implicit confession that the harms of prohibition were not abstract, not evenly distributed, and not accidental. While these legal and social adjustments unfold, one branch of the cannabis family tree, long overshadowed by its intoxicating cousin, is quietly restored to legitimacy. In 2018, the Farm Bill in the United States draws a line at 0% THC and declares that hemp below this threshold is no longer a controlled substance, but an agricultural commodity. Fields of toll, fibers plants return, not for intoxication, but for CBD extraction and fiber. Imagine walking through such a field at dusk, the air cool against your skin, stems brushing your hands, the sound of leaves rattling like distant paper. For centuries, hemp built tropes in sails and cloth. In the modern file, it reappears as wellness oil supplements, textiles, biocomposites, and more an echo of its old roles in a new register. At the same time, research accelerates, trying to catch up with millennia of unsophisticated human experience. Clinical and pre-clinical work explores CBD for anxiety and epilepsy, THC for pain and post-traumatic stress. Alongside the promise, the record also notes risk, concerns about adolescent use and its interaction with developing brains, questions about mental health, particularly in vulnerable individuals, the unknown long-term effects of very high potency products that have no true historical analog. The file here is incomplete. In motion, neither the panacea promised by advocates nor the unambiguous poison once depicted by propagandists, just a plant with real power intersecting with complex human biology, habits, and vulnerabilities. Beyond one country's borders, the pattern of reassessment becomes global. Uruguay legalizes, Canada follows in 2018. In 2020, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs votes to reschedule cannabis, acknowledging, in the coded language of international bureaucracy, that the older classification no longer matches the emerging evidence of medical value. Each of these entries is modest on its own, one nation's law, one committee's vote, but taken together, they mark a turning. The international architecture that once enforced uniform prohibition begins, slowly, to loosen. And under all of this, like a bass note who can feel more than hear, lies the discovery we started this section with: the endocannabinoid system, quietly adjusting pain, mood, appetite, immune function inside every listener, whether they have ever touched the plant or not. So where does this leave us? On one layer, we have a chronology: 1964 for THC, 1985 for Marinol, 1908 and 1993 for CBO and CB2.199 for anandamide, 1996 for California's medical law, 2012 for the first recreational markets, 2018 for a hemp renaissance and a new Canadian policy, 2020 for a UN rescheduling. Dates, named statutes, a neat progression from demonization to partial acceptance. On a deeper layer, another pattern surfaces. A plant that has traveled with us since the Neolithic, woven into rope cloth, paper, ritual, and dramedy, is revealed, at the end of the 20th century, to interact with a system that was always inside us, tuning our internal equilibrium. We spend decades outlawing it, then build pharmaceuticals out of its components, then tax it, then design equity programs to repair the damage from the years when it was a tool of control. Fire alone cannot do this. Floods alone cannot do this. Ice cannot do this. This is a human cycle. A rise, a fall, a silence, and then arise again. The endocannabinoid system is not a metaphor for history, but it rhymes with it. Overcorrections and feedback loops. Attempts to hold the body and the body politic inside a narrow acceptable range, sometimes by methods that create new imbalances elsewhere. As you listen in the dark, perhaps with the faint smell of night air coming through a window and the low hum of a distant appliance, you might feel a strange kinship with this story, because this is not only about cannabis. It is about how we treat what we fear, what we do not yet understand, and what offers both escape and healing. It is about the distance between the stories we tell on the surface and the systems, biological and social, that continue their quiet work underneath. We are, for the moment, in another beginning realm, legalizing an ancient plant, mapping its receptors, weaving it into medicine, industry, and culture, while still arguing about who should profit, who should be forgiven, and what risks are acceptable. If 6 worlds fell before ours, as some myths suggest of earlier cycles, how many times have we played out this same pattern with different tools, different plants, different taboos? And the more unsettling question is this: when the next turning comes, and some future archivist sifts through our layers of land, bone, and residue, what will they conclude we were really afraid of? The plant, or the parts of ourselves it revealed? Until the next night, rest well.